The year was 1877, and the silence in Eleanor Vance's cabin was a physical thing. It had weight and texture, a smothering blanket woven from dust motes dancing in the thin afternoon light, and the threads of a grief so profound it had become the home's very foundation. Outside, the prairie stretched into an endless wind-scoured canvas of ochre and pale green, a landscape that offered no comfort, only a reflection of the vast emptiness within her. The wind howled like a thing grieving with her, its voice a constant companion that scraped against the log walls and rattled the single glass pane of the window, a sound that had long ago replaced the gentle murmur of her husband's breathing beside her in the dark. Arthur had been gone 2 years. The fever that took him had been swift and merciless, a thief in the night that stole the warmth from their bed and the future from their lives. But the silence had truly taken root 6 months after his passing, on the day she had buried their daughter, a tiny, perfect creature who had never drawn a breath. Eleanor had sewn the small burial gown with hands that felt like stone, her stitches neat and even, a testament to a control she no longer possessed in any other part of her existence. She had named the baby Rose, a secret she held tight in her chest, a flower that would never bloom. Her days fell into a rhythm of survival, a litany of chores that numbed her mind and exhausted her body. She mended fences, hauled water from the creek, tended her meager garden, and stared at the horizon until the sun bled into the bruised purple of twilight. She spoke to no one, for there was no one to speak to. The nearest town, a grimy settlement called Redemption, was a full day's ride, and she had no reason to go. The pitying glances of the townsfolk were worse than the solitude. They saw a tragic figure, a poor widow left to the mercy of the elements. They did not see the ghost she had become, a woman moving through the motions of life while her soul remained interred in the cold earth beside 2 wooden crosses on the rise behind the cabin. Her life was a holding pattern, a quiet, desperate waiting for an end. She was too weary to seek herself. The cabin, which Arthur had built with such love and hope, now felt like a tomb. Every object held a memory that cut like glass: his worn leather chair by the hearth, the hook where his coat used to hang, the cradle he had carved, now pushed into a dark corner, covered with a flour sack as if to hide the evidence of a dream that had died. She was a warden of sorrow, and the silence was her prisoner, or perhaps she was its. One evening, a storm rolled in from the west, a monstrous, churning wall of black cloud that swallowed the sky. Rain came down not in drops but in sheets, driven by a wind that shrieked and clawed at the roof. Eleanor secured the shutters, barred the door, and sat in Arthur's chair, watching the fire eat away at the logs in the hearth. She did not feel fear, only a strange detachment, as if the world outside was putting on a violent show for her alone. If the storm tore the cabin apart, if the creek rose and washed her away, it would be a kind of release. She closed her eyes, letting the tempest's fury wash over her, a sound loud enough to finally drown out the silence. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and weeping. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth and sage. When Eleanor unbarred the door, a pale, watery light illuminated the devastation. A section of fence was down, and debris from the creek had been thrown far up the bank. She pulled on her boots and her late husband's canvas coat, the familiar weight a hollow comfort, and set out to survey the damage. She walked toward the creek, her boots sinking into the sodden ground. The water was still high and brown, churning with uprooted saplings and refuse. It was a small, insistent sound that first caught her attention, nearly lost beneath the gurgle of the water. It was a thin, reedy cry like a distressed lamb. She paused, listening. Her heart, a dull and sluggish thing, gave a painful lurch. She scanned the tangled brush along the creek bank, her eyes searching for the source, and then she saw it. Lodged in the low branches of a fallen cottonwood, just above the receding waterline, was a cradle board. It was intricately made, of wood and leather, adorned with quillwork that depicted a soaring hawk. The cry came again, stronger this time, a clear and undeniable wail of distress. Eleanor moved without thinking, her feet carrying her forward through the mud and slick leaves. Her breath caught in her throat. Inside the cradleboard, wrapped tightly in furs, was a baby. Its face was round and dusky, streaked with dirt, its dark eyes squeezed shut as it let out another desperate cry. She stood frozen for a long moment, the world tilting on its axis. The baby was native, its features and the craftsmanship of its carrier leaving no doubt. It was a child of the people her own people feared and maligned, the Lakota who sometimes passed through these lands like ghosts on the horizon. An abyss of questions opened before her. Where were its parents? Were they victims of the storm, or had they left it here? Was it a trap? The stories from redemption filled her head, tales of raids and stolen children, of brutality and vengeance. Fear, a cold and sharp sensation she had not truly felt in years, pierced through her grief-numbed haze. Her first instinct was to back away, to leave it. Taking this child in would invite a world of trouble she was not equipped to handle. The people of redemption would call her a traitor, a fool. Garrett Shaw, the town marshal, would be at her door, his face a mask of grim duty. And what of the child's own people? If they returned and found it gone, would they not seek retribution? But then the baby's cries softened into a series of pitiful, hiccuping whimpers. Its tiny fists, no bigger than walnuts, clenched and unclenched. It was so small, so utterly helpless. In that moment, it was not a Lakota baby or a white baby, not a symbol of conflict or a harbinger of danger. It was just a child, alone and cold and frightened, a child. And a part of Eleanor that she thought had been buried forever, the part that had yearned and prepared and loved a baby of her own, cracked open like dry earth after a rain. With a choked sob that was half terror and half something else entirely, she reached out. Her hands, calloused and rough from farm work, trembled as she carefully lifted the cradleboard from the branches. It was heavier than she expected, a solid, living weight. The baby quieted as she drew it close, its wide, dark eyes blinking open to stare up at her. In their depths, she saw not a threat, but a reflection of her own profound loneliness. Holding this child, she made a choice. She turned her back on the creek and the questions it held and walked toward the cabin, her steps sure and deliberate for the first time in a very long time. The silence was waiting for her inside, but for the first time, she was not returning to it alone. Inside the cabin, the world shrank to the dimensions of the small, squirming life in her arms. Eleanor carefully unlaced the leather ties of the cradleboard and unwrapped the layers of rabbit fur and soft hide. The baby, a boy, was cold to the touch, but seemingly unharmed. His skin was the color of rich copper, and a shock of fine black hair covered his well-shaped head. He began to fuss again, his little mouth opening and closing in a desperate, searching motion. Hunger. It was a simple, universal need. She worked with a fumbling urgency, her mind racing. She had no mother's milk to offer, and the provisions in her larder were ill-suited for an infant. She remembered an old remedy her grandmother had used for orphaned lambscow's milk, watered down and sweetened with a touch of molasses. She stoked the fire, her hands clumsy as she warmed the mixture in a small pan. The baby's cries grew louder, more insistent, filling the cabin with a sound of pure, demanding life. It was a noise that scoured the corners of the silent rooms, chasing away the ghosts that lingered there. Feeding him was a messy, frustrating affair. She dipped the corner of a clean rag into the warm milk and tried to coax it into his mouth. More of it dribbled down his chin than went into his stomach, but he sucked at it weakly, his small body tense with effort. Eleanor's focus narrowed completely to this task. The world outside, the town of redemption, the mysterious origins of this child, all of it faded away. There was only the fire, the warm milk, and the fragile life in her lap. After a few precious swallows, he seemed to tire, his eyes drooping shut. She cleaned him as best she could with a damp cloth and wrapped him in one of Arthur's old wool shirts, the soft, worn fabric engulfing him. He was so impossibly small. She held him against her chest, feeling the faint, fluttering beat of his heart against her own. The warmth of his body seeped into her, a strange and powerful heat that seemed to travel up her arms and thaw the ice that had encased her own heart for so long. For the next few days, a new routine established itself, one dictated not by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the needs of the child. Eleanor barely slept, her ear tuned to his slightest stirrings. She moved the old cradle from its dark corner, cleaned it, and lined it with her softest blankets. Placing him inside it felt like a monumental act, a transgression against her own grief. She expected a fresh wave of pain, a crippling memory of the daughter who had never lain there. But as she looked at the sleeping boy, his face serene in the firelight, what she felt was not sorrow, but a fierce, terrifying wave of protectiveness. She did not name him at first. To name him would be to claim him, to forge a bond she was not yet ready to admit was already forming. He was simply the baby, a temporary charge, a problem she had yet to solve. She kept watch on the horizon, expecting to see a party of riders, either white or native, coming to reclaim him or to punish her. But the plains remained stubbornly empty. The silence outside the cabin returned, but inside it had been vanquished. It was filled with coos and cries, with the soft sound of her own footsteps pacing the floor, and eventually with the sound of her own voice. It started as a low, unconscious hum as she rocked him one night, his small body racked with colicky cries. The sound seemed to soothe him slightly, his wails subsiding into whimpers. Without thinking, the hum found words, a melody she had buried deep in her memory. It was the lullaby her mother had sung to her, the one she had planned to sing to her own Rose. "Hush, little one, now, don't you cry, Mama's gonna sing you a lullaby." The words felt like stones in her throat. Her voice was rusty, cracked with disuse and unshed tears. The first verse was a struggle, a battle against the grief that rose to choke her. But the baby in her arms grew still, his dark eyes fixed on her face. She saw no judgment there, only a deep, placid attention. So she sang on, her voice growing stronger, clearer, filling the small cabin with the simple, sad tune. She sang of meadows and ponies and a love that would keep him safe through the night. It was a promise she had no right to make, yet she made it anyway, pouring all of her thwarted love, her aching loneliness, and her desperate hope into the melody. When the song was over, he was asleep, his breath a soft, rhythmic whisper. Eleanor looked down at him, her vision blurred by the tears that finally fell, hot and cleansing, down her cheeks. He was no longer just the baby. In her heart, she gave him a name, Chayton. She wasn't sure where she'd heard it, perhaps a word whispered in town, but it felt right. It meant falcon, something strong, something that could soar. In that moment, singing a lullaby meant for her dead daughter to this living, breathing boy, Eleanor Vance stopped being a ghost. She had something to protect. She had a son. The fragile peace of their new existence was shattered 2 weeks later by the arrival of a horseman. It was not the Lakota warriors she had half expected, but Jasper Hale, a trapper who sometimes passed through, trading pelts for supplies. His eyes widened in disbelief when he saw Chayton nestled in a sling against Eleanor's chest as she chopped firewood. "Good God, woman," he stammered, his gaze darting from her to the baby and back again. "Where did you get that?" Eleanor's grip tightened on the axe handle. He was a gift from the storm. Jasper's face was a mixture of awe and fear. "It's a Sioux baby. You can't keep it here, Eleanor. It ain't safe, for you or for it." "He is safe with me," she said, her voice low and steady. It was a truth that had settled deep in her bones. Jasper shook his head, backing his horse away, as if the child might be contagious. "The folks in Redemption won't see it that way. Not after what happened to the Donovan family last spring. You're playing with fire." He didn't stay long, casting nervous glances over his shoulder as he rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and dread in his wake. Eleanor knew he was right. News would travel fast. She had been living in a bubble of her own making, a world that consisted of only her and the child. Now, the outside world was about to come crashing in. She spent the rest of the day on edge, starting at every gust of wind, every cry of a distant hawk. She bolted the door and shuttered the window long before dusk, the cabin once again feeling like a fortress. But this time, she was not defending it from memories, but from a living, breathing threat. It was 3 days later when Garrett Shaw arrived. He did not come alone. He was flanked by 2 deputies from Redemption, their faces grim and set. Marshal Shaw was a tall, unbending man whose righteousness was as stark and unforgiving as the landscape. He had lost a brother in a skirmish years ago, a loss that had calcified his heart against any native person. He dismounted and strode to her door, his spurs jingling a menacing rhythm. He didn't bother to knock. "Eleanor," he called out, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We know you have it. Open this door." Eleanor stood in the center of the room, her shotgun in her hands. Chayton was sleeping soundly in his cradle, oblivious to the danger. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. She had faced down grief, loneliness, and despair, but this was different. This was a fear that was sharp and immediate. "Go away, Garrett," she called back, her voice trembling only slightly. "You have no business here." "That child is my business," he retorted, his voice rising. "It's a danger to this territory and a danger to you. We heard a band of Lakota lost a young one. They'll come looking for it, and they won't be friendly when they find it with you. We're here to take it to the fort, for its own good, for your protection." His words were poisonously reasonable, twisting concern into a threat. She knew what "for its own good" meant. The fort would send him to a government school in the East, a place designed to strip children of their language, their culture, their very identity. They would erase the boy she had come to love and replace him with a stranger. "He stays with me," she said, the words a raw vow. "He is my son." A heavy silence followed. Then the marshal's voice, cold as iron. "Don't be a fool, Eleanor. We can do this the easy way, or we can do this the hard way, but we are not leaving without that child." Eleanor's knuckles were white on the stock of the shotgun. The hard way. The words hung in the air, a promise of violence. She looked from the barred door to the peaceful cradle. She had lost one child to the cruelty of fate. She would not lose another to the cruelty of men. She braced the shotgun against her shoulder, the cold metal, a shocking comfort. "Then you'll have to come through me," she whispered to the empty room. The afternoon sun began its slow descent, painting the prairie in long, ominous shadows. Eleanor waited, every nerve stretched taut. Through a crack in the shutters, she could see the Marshal Shaw and his deputies, waiting patiently, confident that the lone widow would eventually break. They had built a small fire, the smoke rising in a thin grey pillar against the darkening sky. They were settling in for a siege. As dusk deepened into true night, Chayton began to stir. He let out a soft cry, not of distress, but of waking. Eleanor lowered the shotgun and went to him, her movements stiff. She lifted him from the cradle, his small, warm body, a comfort against her own chilling fear. He rooted against her neck, and she knew he was hungry. Her hands shook as she prepared his milk, her eyes constantly darting toward the door. The men outside were talking now, their voices low but audible. They were growing impatient. She could hear the scrape of boots, the jingle of a harness. They were getting ready to move. Holding Chayton close, she began to pace the floor, her mind a frantic whirl. There was no escape. The prairie offered no cover, no sanctuary. Her home, her fortress, had become her trap. Despair, the old familiar companion, began to creep back in, its cold tendrils wrapping around her heart. Chayton started to fuss, sensing her terror. His whimpers threatened to escalate into a full-blown cry that would surely provoke the men outside. Eleanor's own panic rose with his. She had to soothe him. She had to soothe herself. She closed her eyes, and the only shield she had ever found against the darkness came to her lips. "Hush, little one, now don't you cry." Her voice was barely a whisper at first, fragile and thin, but as she sang, she poured every ounce of her defiance into the melody. She sang for Arthur, for Rose, for the little boy in her arms who had pulled her back from the edge of nothingness. Her voice grew stronger, rising to fill the cabin, a single, clear note of maternal love against a chorus of hate. She sang it as a prayer, as a weapon, as a final, desperate act of love. Outside, the men heard it. The talking stopped. Marshal Shaw took a step toward the door, his face a thunderous scowl. "Enough of this foolishness," he snarled to his deputies. "We're going in." He raised his boot to kick the door, and then he froze. From the deep twilight, a presence emerged. It was not a sound that stopped him, but a sudden, profound shift in the very air. One moment, there were three of them against a lone woman. The next, they were not alone. Figures rose from the tall grass, materializing from the shadows like spirits of the earth. They were silent, their forms lean and powerful in the dying light. Feathers adorned their hair, and their faces were stern, impassive masks. They held bows and rifles, their posture relaxed but radiating a lethal readiness. One warrior, then 5, then 20, then 50. They kept coming, appearing from all directions, a river of silent men flowing out of the prairie to form a wide, impenetrable circle around the cabin. They moved with a ghostly grace, encircling not only the cabin, but also the 3 terrified white men who were trapped within their ring. The last count was impossible, but it felt like hundreds. An army had risen from the plains. Marshal Shaw and his deputies stood paralyzed, their hands hovering near their holsters, but making no move to draw. The sheer number of warriors was overwhelming, but it was their silence that was most terrifying. There were no war cries, no threatening shouts. There was only a vast, potent stillness, the patient waiting of men who held all the power. The prairie, which had been Eleanor's prison, had become her salvation. From the center of the warrior line, one man walked forward. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that looked as if it were carved from granite, etched with lines of grief and authority. He carried no weapon in his hands, but his presence was more commanding than any rifle. He stopped 20 feet from Marshal Shaw, his dark eyes sweeping over the 3 men with cold disdain before coming to rest on the cabin door. Inside, Eleanor had fallen silent. She had heard the sudden halt to the activity outside, sensed the change. Peeking again through the crack in the shutter, her breath hitched in her throat. She saw them, the Lakota. The people she had feared might come in vengeance had arrived as guardians. She clutched Chayton tighter, her heart pounding with a new kind of fear, one mingled with a wild, impossible hope. The lead warrior turned his gaze back to Garrett Shaw. He did not need to speak. His message was clear in his stance, in the unwavering gaze of the 200 warriors who stood behind him. This home was protected. This woman and this child were under their care. Shaw, for the first time in his life, looked utterly defeated. The blustering certainty had drained from him, replaced by a pale, clammy fear. He slowly, carefully, raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. Without a word, he and his deputies backed away, mounted their horses, and fled into the night, swallowed by the darkness from which the protectors had emerged. A long, breathless silence followed their departure. The warriors did not move. They simply stood, a living wall around her home. Eleanor, trembling, slowly unbarred the door and stepped out onto the porch. Chayton held tight against her shoulder. The tall warrior who had led them met her gaze. There was no menace in his eyes, only a profound, soul-deep weariness and a flicker of gratitude. He took a step closer and spoke, his voice low and resonant, the Lakota words unfamiliar to her ears. But then he used a single word she understood, a word he must have learned from traders. Mother. He gestured from her to the baby, then placed a hand over his own heart. He followed it with another word, Tashunka, his name. He then pointed to the sleeping child. Chayton. He knew the name she had given him. He had been close. He had been listening. Through a combination of gestures and the few words they shared, the story unfolded. Tashunka was Chayton's father. His wife, Istas, had died giving birth to their son during a forced flight from soldiers. Grieving and hunted, Tashunka had been faced with an impossible choice. He could not care for a newborn while drawing the soldiers away from his people. He had seen Eleanor's isolated cabin, a place of quiet sorrow that he recognized in his own soul. In an act of desperate faith, he had left his son where he knew a woman lived, a woman who had known loss. He had watched from a distance as she took the cradle board. He had stayed hidden nearby, observing her care, her tenderness. He had heard her sing the lullaby. He had judged her heart and found it good. When he saw the marshal and his men arrive, he had sent a signal, and his warriors, who had been searching for him, had come. He did not ask for his son back. His gaze fell upon the way Eleanor held the child, the fierce, protective love that radiated from her. He looked at her small, lonely cabin, then at the two graves on the hill. He understood. He saw a woman who had a hole in her heart, and a child who needed a mother to fill it. In the days that followed, a new reality settled over the homestead. The warriors did not leave. They made a camp a respectful distance away, a silent, watchful community. Tashunka explained, through a younger warrior who knew more English, that it was not their way to take a child from a mother who had proven her spirit. Eleanor had saved his son. She had sung a sacred song of protection over him. By their custom, she had earned the right to be his mother, and Tashunka, as his father, would also be there. Their families were now bound. The homestead on the prairie was transformed. It was no longer a place of isolation, but the heart of an unlikely community. The silence was gone forever, replaced by the distant sounds of the Lakota camp, the laughter of children who came to peek at the white woman and her brown-skinned baby, and the low, comforting murmur of conversation between Eleanor and Tashunka as they slowly, haltingly learned to speak each other's language. Eleanor taught him about her Arthur and her Rose. He taught her about his Istas, whose name meant snow, and the falcon she had seen in a dream before their son was born. They shared their grief, and in sharing it, found it lessened. The two graves on the hill were soon joined by a third marker, a simple stack of stones for Istas, so that Chayton's two mothers could rest near each other. She no longer watched the horizon with fear, but with a sense of peace. The ring of warriors was a constant, reassuring presence. They were her family now, her protectors. Her little cabin was no longer a tomb but a sanctuary, a bridge between two worlds that had been forged not by treaties or war, but by the lullaby of a grieving woman and the cry of an abandoned child. She had sung a song of love into the deepest darkness, and in the most unexpected way, a nation had answered, guarding her and her son as their very own.